was given a seminar last month, and I asked to the crowd, I said, what percentage of your phones do you think are answered during business hours? I said, raise your hand if you think 95 to 100% of your phones are answered during business hours. And about a half to 2/3 of the room, a half to 3/4 of the room raised their hand that 95 to 100% of their phone calls during business hours were being answered in their practice. I said, okay, how many of you think 90 to 95% of your calls are being answered? And a couple people raised their hand. And then I said, how many of you feel that under 90% of your calls during business hours are answered? And I bet there were maybe 3 people in a room of 450 dentists actually raised their hand. And so then I advanced the slide on my presentation, and I showed them the reality of where the average practice is in the United States today. The average practice answers 66% of their phone calls during business hours. The top 10% in the United States, based on a sampling of almost 20,000 practices, a top 10% practice is at 90 to 91%. An average 50th percentile practice is at 66%. And the bottom 10% are at 34%. And when I showed these stats, nobody thinks that is their practice. Nobody even can dream of thinking. Let me tell you, of the 20,000 practices that were a part of our study, the top performing practice, the single top performing practice, answered 96% of their calls. 96% is the top during business hours. And I think that just goes to show you, like, what percentage of calls should I be answering? Well, the answer is all of them. What percentage of the calls in your practice can you answer? Well, if you have the right processes and the right training and the right people, and you use something similar to what we teach with our BATline system, which is extremely effective, you can get to 90 or 95%. Should you be answering more? I don't like the word should. It implies I'm not doing something right. If the top 10% of the practices in this country are growing at 35% year over year, and they're answering 90 to 92% of their calls during business hours, that's pretty good in my book. And I think that's where you need to really aim for is, let's be in the top 20%. Let's be in the top 10%. Answering 100% isn't practical.